Please now. Let's take this. The students have technical classes. The UG students are informed.
Faculty are right in front.
Faculty, yes, faculty is scattered, maybe shutting their eyes, taking the class. From here. Young faculty. No, you begin. Please give a clap for. He is here today in capacity of a poet as well as a teacher of poetry. All right. We often read Indian poetry in English, in black and white. We have heard about poets. We hardly have met them. In this eastern part of India, we hardly have any chance to interact with any of them. Many of them have passed away, whom we call the old school of Indian poetry in English. Among the new, all right, Ranjit is a torchbearer. He is in the forefront. He is not only a practicing poet, but he is also a translator, and he is also a scholar of art curator, interpreter of art as well as poetry, and a translator. So his hands are always working. Unlike the image of the old poets, Attohola, who forget themselves and live in a quiet, melancholy corner. Ranjit is not one. But at the same time, he shares something with the worldview of those poets. He is totally self-effacing. Never have I found anywhere where Ranjit is self-advertising. Nowhere. Unlike even some modern Bengali poets of these days. So he is a man who is rooted to the ground and with a vision piercing the sky. Like W. Yeats in his Aniket of Glass, he says, give me that Michelangelo vision so that I can pierce the sky. We hope Ranjit good health and more fruitful and productive years in future. Right? We are grateful that he has come here to give a talk to you. All right? Talk will be in the afternoon. This is a workshop. Ranjit himself will explain what he has in mind. All right? Thank you, Ranjit.
Thank you.
On behalf of the department, we welcome you. The printout and the poems. Please, yes. Yes. No, some of them have, otherwise they will take the mobile phones.
No. They will access it from this.
From here?
Yeah.
Okay.
No mobile.
Okay, no mobile. And in case you have one, please put them on silent mode. Please. I have put mine. আমরা যেটা এখানে পড়ান সেই সেটটা
ওই তো রামায়ণে যেটা দিয়ে শুরু হচ্ছে সেটা একটু
এই
জুম করে দাও না ফুল স্ক্রিন দরকার নেই জুম করলে হবে না 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 বেরোতে হলে এসকেপ করতে যাবে এসকেপ করতে হবে
না দিয়ে দিচ্ছি না এটা এখানেই থাকে
Let's start with this. We do one of these and then well, in the first place, I have to say it's a great pleasure for me to be back here, as Arjun knows, because he and Professor Paul invited me 20 years ago to this campus. It's really wonderful to be back. And I have to apologize to all of you because I believe it's a holiday. And you would all have been enjoying your long weekend instead of being cooped up here thinking about poetry. So now that that's out of the way, we can get down to this workshop. And also, Arjun, thank you very much for your warm and generous words of welcome. But it also got me thinking about what it is that poets do. And I know that you're probably fed up of hearing about Tagore because, he is such a salient and ambient figure. But I find myself constantly going back to Tagore, both as a poet, someone who created a beautiful musicality, still gains our attention after all these decades, but also as someone who crafted ways of dealing with the world in different ways. And I think that that's one of the things I want to talk about this morning. What does it mean to be a poet, and not only someone who considers text, the creation of texts, but also addresses the larger question of how to be in the world, how as an artist to address the urgencies of the world. And through some of these poems that we will work on together, I'd like us to think these questions through. And there's always for me the question of how the poem is a mystery. How it is that we find it in the pages of a poetry anthology, we find it in a book on a library shelf, or it pops up online, and it doesn't carry any ambient information with it, usually. It is itself. It's a literary presence. How do we make sense of it? I think that is the question that plagues us, whether we are readers at large, or students, or teachers. Every now and again I find, for my sins, some of my poems have now landed on the curricula of universities. So once in a while I get a frantic email from an academic in Hyderabad or Coimbatore or from Shimla, and they say, "What does your poem mean?" And I'm tempted to say a poem should be and not mean, or whatever it is that Archibald Matrish read. A poem should be and should not mean, but be.
But majesty.
That's right, yeah. But then I think to myself, it's all right for me to sit there and say, well, a poem should be and not mean. But if you have to unpack a poem for your students, or if you as students have to offer some account of what's going on in the poem, then that's a very different level of urgency. And I understand what it's like if you're reading a poem and it doesn't make any sense to you. It's almost like, although you know the language it's written in, it's almost like you can't read it. It's as if it was written in a language you didn't know. So I want us to think today about how poetry could be a language that we don't know, and what is it that poets do with language. Because there's a certain everydayness to language, which is how we speak to each other, how we might write informally, how we might communicate with one another. And then there's a certain more formal register, or a more experimental register, which is how poets would recraft language. So, what's that distance like? What does it mean to make that leap? These are questions that I've found very interesting. In the context of theatre, Raymond Williams, the Welsh Marxist critic, once talked about how audiences usually have a certain structure of expectation. You know, you go to a play or read a poem or a novel with a certain training that you have to understand these things. But often what is happening in the play or the poem or the novel is that the writer is taking liberties, or they're ahead of the game in some way. So they're working from a different structure of expression. And there's always that gap. And it's not, sometimes we tend to, you're all students of English, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Sometimes we think these are exclusively problems of English literature, but I don't think that's true. This would happen particularly in the scenario that we usually call modernism and after. This is something you come across in every single language and its literature. Sometimes I wonder, for instance, reading Joy Goswami, who I only read through the translations of my friend Shapurna Chatterjee, I sometimes think, what is it like for a reader of Bengali to read Joyda's poetry and to be startled by it, to be surprised, to not know where an image is going? I think these questions haunt readers across languages. So there are some very specific issues with English which we can go into in a bit, but this is what I'd ask you to keep in mind. So there's this whole question of the meaning of the poem. Then there's also the musicality of the poem. And in these last months I've been thinking a lot about it, because even if we dispense with a more formal prosody and go into what is sometimes loosely and I think inaccurately called free verse, you're still working with the ghosts of meter. You still have a certain metricality, you're still thinking of a music into which your words fall as a poet. But I was thinking, in a world where the most insistent prosody that you have, the beat of the word, is the falling of bombs in Gaza, or the noise that a machine gun makes and how you hear it on television. When that kind of, if you will, military prosody is the music of our lives, what kind of chance does any other kind of music have? What kind of quieter music that can we compose as poets? What kind of different, more redemptive music can we hear as readers, as listeners? These are the kinds of questions also that I'd like you to engage with, because this might be a safe cocoon where we're thinking about literary texts, but our lives, and these texts all take their place in this far larger and very insecure world. And when we look closely at some of these poems, we find that they also are thinking about that larger world. Yeah. So what I'd also like us to do is, I'd like one of you to read these poems as we go along. And we'll shuttle between the two sets of poems that you have. You have one that's already in your service, and then there's the other one which I've shared. Who wants to read A.K. Ramanujan's A River? You're going to read. Do you have a mic?
My turn. যে পড়বে একটু উঠে এসো এখানে।
Would you like to, or are you? Okay.
A river, A.K. Ramanujan. In Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples every summer, a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand reeds, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them. The wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones, safen water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets only sang of the floods. She was there for a day. When they had the floods, people everywhere talked of the inches raising, of the precise number of cobble steps, run over by the water rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 villages, 1 pregnant woman and a couple of cows named Gopi and Binda as usual. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned with perhaps twins in her kicking at blank walls even before birth. He said, the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, and then it carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Binda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins, with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. You know, this is a poem that I think I first encountered in a poetry textbook called Panorama, which we had at school. And as later, much later, you realize that the textbook was published by Oxford University Press, and these were Anglophone Indian poets, Ramanujan, Narendrapur, Jayat Mahapatra, Ezekiel, Keith Patel, who had all been published in the 3 Crowns series by Oxford. But you know, when you're a kid, you're not thinking of publishing history. You're really receiving this and being a bit baffled by it. I remember I certainly was baffled. But over the years that I've come back to this poem, and each time I hear it, thank you for reading it just now. You know, it's just the way in which Ramanujan's entire life and his work is compressed in this relatively brief poem. You know, and I think it's part of the magic of a certain kind of contemporary or modern lyric poem that it manages to compress worlds of experience into its brevity of expression. If you want to think about an earlier kind of exemplar forage, you might think of the so-called Karnakavya, right? The fragmentary poem, short poem. But this kind of poem is neither just a fragment nor is it a traditional lyric. What it's also doing is reflecting on the circumstances of its own creation, in a way. Now, you'll all know that Ramanujan, in addition to being a poet, was also a great translator of the Tamil Sangam literature, for one, the Kurundakoi, one of the 8 great anthologies. And he also translated the Vachanas of the Veerashaya poets. And it's incredible how, through a certain relay of poetic forms, he was able to bring in the compression of the Sangam poems and the Vachanas of, say, Vasavarna, for instance. He brought all that into a relay with Ezra Pound, for instance. There was a certain belief in the power of the image, which is central to Ramanujan's poetics. But there are also things outside of the poem which you can only infer from the action, you know? And I'll just go over it again. The work's first stanza, or strophe, call it what you will, seems like a whole series of details. But it's specifically the framework, the paradigm from which it's coming is cinema. In a way, it's cinematic. The way those details are summoned into being and brought together. At one level, you think, oh, is this just sort of parataxis? Is it a list? But then you realize that each detail is being added to another. It's turning into a kind of a montage. In Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples, there's also self-reflexivity going on here. You know, it's about people who are in the moment in their lives, but they're also caught up with repeating earlier patterns in a certain way. City of temples and poets who sang of cities and temples in a way that's an image of a tradition. Because the tradition is strengthened by certain forms of repetition, revisiting. But the downside of it is you're also left to think as a reader, are they caught up in a time warp? Are they trapped in some ways? So one timeline of temporality within this book has to do with continuity through repetition. Yeah? Every summer, a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand, ribs, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates and the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them, the wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones, shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets only sang of the floods. So what you have here is actually a post-dam river. You know, it's interesting that already in this first strophe you're being told that tradition cannot simply continue. The poets may be singing of the past, but the landscapes that they were invested in, the landscapes, the riverscapes, the performances of nature in which that poetics was invested doesn't exist any longer. The poets only sang of the floods. At that point, earlier on, I remember revisiting this poem over the years, and I thought, is he making fun of the poets who only sang of the floods? Couldn't they see what was going on? Today, I think of it much more under the sign of crisis. What does it mean to remember a time when nature was much more bountiful? What does it mean to remember a time when humankind had not interfered so destructively in nature? 20 years ago when I came here, I remember we drove past paddy fields and I remember forests for sure. Today when we did this ride, it had no sense that we were outside of the city. There was a certain rurality to the city, but we were still very much in the metropolitan area. 20 years ago, I really felt we were going far out into nature. And it's that kind of slow shock that each of us absorbs in our lives. Many of you are probably not old enough to remember the times like that. But when I think back, I remember how astonishing that this world we knew of slopes, of wooded slopes, of streams and so on, just simply doesn't exist anymore. This is true of my city too, where I live, Bombay. I remember parts of it which I can't even recognize today because they're completely covered over with apartment blocks, if you will. So what happens here in this poem is that on the one hand you have a poetic tradition, a set of tropes, a set of images, which are all caught up in a prior understanding of the natural world and human connection with it. But what humankind in a political or economic role has done is something else. And the landscape is actually been reduced to something that is really the outcome of violence in a certain way. And it's intriguing that when you revisit the images with this kind of thought in mind, you'll see that there is a certain way in which Ramanujan brings the inanimate into adjacency with living things. The wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles. The dry ones, shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. So, stones that are now revealed because the water level is so low. And there's a way in which he, as a poet now, is trying to bring these inanimate objects to life by comparing them to the animal life that is also part of this riverine ecology. He was there for a day when they had the floods. So again, rather than a seasonal phenomenon that people could look forward to and celebrate, this is now an eruption. It's a disruption of normal life. People everywhere talk to the inches rising, of the precise number of coupled steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses one pregnant woman and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda as usual. Here, the tonality, the register, the language itself changes. It changes into a far more, if you will, scientific and journalistic way of enumerating experience. So within the same poem, you see that the first stanza is looking at the difference between a certain imaginary of the ecology, if you will, and what has actually gone wrong with the landscape at a time of rapid economic and ecological change. And in the second stanza, there is a comment, a quiet, intuitive comment on the way in which our consciousness and our sensibility have changed. The same people who would once have approached the landscape through poetry, and sometimes you think, there are tumris, there are kajaris, there are all kinds of songs in which, say, the monsoons, or the river, or the clouds are all celebrated in a certain way. It's in a sense tragic that today when we think about nature, it's A, through the lens of fear and anxiety, and B, through this kind of language. It's almost like there's a flood scale there. And they're talking about how high the river's rising, what is the tide mark, how many steps on the ghats that they've covered, and suddenly you think you're reading a news report. There was 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, a couple of cows. It suddenly becomes numerical in a strange way. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned, with perhaps streams in her, kicking at blank walls even before birth. And this is just a little beyond the midpoint of the poem, and that's where you feel this is Ramanujan as a modernist, a multilingual poet, saying to himself, this is my challenge. I could quote the old poets, but how do I find a new poetic form to talk about this present catastrophe? The kind of intimate catastrophe where a pregnant woman is drowned, perhaps with twins. And how does one, if one is trained in a kind of register where one is thinking about mythic events and how they're tragic, how do you then create a poetry out of the intimacy of anonymous people? And I think for me this poem really makes a claim on our attention with these lines. This is really the challenge. The poet doesn't have any answers. It's really a question. It's a question of how do I release myself as an ethical subject, as a creative sensibility towards someone who I don't know, but whose tragedy is clear to me. He said, the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year. And then it carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and before you know it, it's almost like you're watching an action replay of a certain kind. But it's not quite the same, because he concludes with this very strong sense that one has to be poetic about other things than whatever was given to us by tradition. We have to find a new language. So, in a way, the poem is about what, to use a rather Latin term, one would call it ars poetica. It's about the poetic art. It's how do you rededicate yourself to being a poet? How do you rededicate yourself to speaking for or alongside people who will never have the power of articulation? Because remember that all of the people in this reportage, the women who are dying, the cows, the children, none of them really have the power of articulation. So in a sense, the poet is also here presenting himself as possibly in a very considerate and considered way as a spokesperson for people and events who otherwise don't make it to the radar of visibility. So that's my reading of this poem. But I'm intrigued by what this poem means to some of you when you study it or teach it. So I won't be sitting up here doing all the talking and be a monologue otherwise. I would really welcome views on how you respond to this poem. What do you think of the poem? What do you think it's doing? And what do you think of my account of it? Who wants to go first?
The final section with he said is definitely a distancing. And definitely this is sarcasm.
It is.
The way, as you said, in a reportage manner, this comes in the TV, the way they say, or in the
Yeah.
newspaper. There is a section which is not the poet's section.
No,
This is the representational section.
that's right.
So there is satire, there is sarcasm. So I think there we can open up a kind of debate. You see, so when towards the end of Enterprise, Ezekiel says that home is the place to gather grace.
Yeah.
So this is the home that I think about Ezekiel. Ramanujan will be saying, yes, we write about this, I write about this. Yes, I'm concerned about it.
Yeah.
So, within poetic body, poets speak to each other.
Absolutely.
Poems also speak to each other.
Absolutely.
And Enterprise has many such spin-off poems by others, Shikta Kumar,
Exactly.
and others.
Yeah.
So it's nice.
Because I think for that whole generation, the question of how to represent this larger country to which they belonged, a society in turbulence, and how to present yourself as someone speaking a language marked with colonial privilege, how to use that language while still connecting with larger social questions. I think that was definitely a dilemma for all of them.
Today, what's the situation? Is it the same today also? Or?
No, partly because also thanks to the exertions and the contributions of some of these people, these poets, my generation of poets doesn't really have that question of what are we doing with this language? Because many of us translate as well. So we are multilingual readers who, as it happens, are monolingual writers. We may write only in one language, but we read in other languages. And that, we were set on this path in many ways by poets of these earlier generations. Ramanujan translating from Tamil and Kannada, Agasha Shahidali translating from Urdu, K.P. Narwala would translate quite often from Urdu. He would make versions of Greek poems. So there's a tremendous understanding that your poetic impulse is not contained within one language. So that's, that has been very, very liberating, I think, for my generation of poets. Also, without that guilt of, or the defensiveness of feeling that you're within this one language, because English is absorbent, it changes, it mutates. It's not a language of fixity, never has been.
Students, do you have any comment, any question? Yes, please.
Sir, a few minutes ago we were talking about how the rhythm of war, the mortal sounds and all the one planets, how do they associate with the rhythm or the metrical system of poems? I would like to have a share some light.
It's in one sense it's a challenge because that kind of, in a sense, it's a monotony. That's the beat and the rhythm of our lives today. It also stands for a kind of crisis that has completely overtaken our consciousness. So, in confronted with that, we have to think about how we move away and listen to other kinds of music and prosody. So, in a sense, it's a kind of figurative challenge. So there is that.
how do we approach that?
Yeah, and how we resist it. I think that's the important question here. It's really about living at a time when there are so many claims on our attention which tend to either just subordinate our minds or they fragment our attention. And then you're summoned to a certain kind of attentiveness by a poem, and it's inner music. So how do you then open yourself to it? And that's what I meant by that question. Really.
You can move to other point.
May I say something?
Yes, of course.
I feel the section, the third section, when reading this, it's so much pirate.
Yeah.
And the juxtaposition of the two cars, opium and
Yeah.
it inspires the analysis. And the concept of the larger world,
Yes.
where we are completely using it different
Correct.
reality that is taking place around us. Aligned by T.S. Eliot's views, the world revolves like ancient women gathered fluid in big empires. That is nice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Even he said non-self attitude.
What's that?
Yeah, non-self attitude. What is happening?
Yes, yes. And how to confront that, yeah. I would maybe move to Keki Garwala's The King Speaks. Story. I think it's in the other. The poems in the other set that you had were poems that, they're poems that have traveled with me for decades. And, someone wakes me up and says, which are the 6 or so poems in the Anglophone Indian tradition that mean something to you always? These are the ones I will mention. There's also the Shahid one, right? Yes. Since we've been talking about war, and how to take up a certain position in relation to larger urgencies being very interesting. Now, Keki Darawal, as many of you know, he just passed away. But if you know something of his biography, you will know that he was a member of the IPS, the Indian Police Service. He eventually went into intelligence and was in research and analysis wing. He was also posted abroad on diplomatic missions. So the public life was very much that of law and order, intelligence, diplomacy. He was really a civil servant, a member of government, and a wielder of authority. And as a poet, he always was in a position of resistance. He would question authority, he would question power, he would think critically about what it is that people in authority do. So, he's someone who inspired me greatly, and I was always perplexed and also in admiration of how he managed to do this. Having a very high-profile and successful career within government, but also as a poet, equally well-known, holding often quite the opposite views. But it becomes a complex meditation on power, on authority, on what it means to hold the power of life and death over other people. And in this case, it came from actually having. Some of us have to imagine these things when we write about kings. In Keki's case, he actually had held that kind of power. So, I'm going to read this poem. It's longish, but then we'll talk about it. The king speaks to the scribe, 3rd century BC. First, Kartikeya, there's no pride involved, no humility. Understand this. I speak of atonement. That is, if blood can ever be wiped away with words, we will engrave this message on volcanic rock right here, where the earth still reeks of slaughter. 100,000 caught in death, mind you. The battlefield stank so that heaven had to hold a cloth to its nose. I trod this plain, dark and glutinous with gore, my chariot wheels squelching in the bloody mire. Nothing stands now between them and destruction. Neither moat, nor bridge, nor hut, nor dawn leaf. No lighted tapers call them to their village. It is to them that you will speak, or rather, I will speak through you. So don't enunciate the law of piety, no aphorisms which say that good is difficult and sin easy, and no palaver about 2 beeffowl and just 1 antelope roasting in my kitchen instead of an entire hecatomb as in my father's days. There may be huts where they have nothing to burn on hearth fires. Spare me the shame. And no taboos, please, forbidding the capping of roosters or drinking of spirituous liquors, the castration of bulls and rams and the branding of horses. So listen with care, Kartikeya, and I will tell you what to write. First, talk about the sorrows of conquest and other miseries attendant on enslavement. In all lands live Brahmins, anchorites, and householders, each enmeshed in the outer skin of relationships, that network of duty and urge, impulse, through which each charts his particular furrow, and a sword falls on such people, and their children are blighted while the affection of their friends remains undiminished. Mark that. Don't talk merely of raping and slaughter, but also of separation from loved ones. And about my sorrow, what will you say? How will you touch upon that weed-ridden lake floor of my despair and keep from drowning? Say simply that of all the people killed or captured, if the 1,000th part were to suffer as before, the pain would overwhelm me. Tell them I have abjured pride, the lowest can abuse me now, and I shall not answer. Let the dust of humility cover my head. Even the tribals, dark and bullet-headed, the blubber-skinned, the ones from whom our demons and yakshas have borrowed their faces, I invite to my fold. Let them turn from crime and their aboriginal ways, and they will not suffer. Cut deeper than the cuts of my sword, so that even as moss covers the letters, they are visible. Write whatever you chance on. Don't look for a white quarter of boulder. Anything will do. A mass of trap rock or just a stone sheet. And a language simple. Something the forest folk can understand. I am not speaking to kings, to Antiocha and Maga or Alikasura. I know high-flown language. I am not here to appease gods. Even they must be ignored for a while and their altar fires turn cold. Men don't have enough fuel to burn their dead. Mind you, Kartikeya, between me and them is blood. Your words will have to reach across to them like a tide of black oxen crossing a ford. I was introduced to this poem when I was about, I think, 16 or 17, by Geef Patel, who was an old friend. Geef was also a poet. He also, unfortunately, passed away quite recently. I don't know if you've read his poetry, or certainly many people grew up reading On Killing a Tree, which was the one poem of his that was in the textbooks. But Geef was always fascinated by his poem. And when I first read it, I realized why. And also I've grown to appreciate it more and more because it also invites us to think of, well, the very first question. You have to know something about these characters for it to make sense. And I sometimes wonder, if you didn't know this was Ashoka speaking, would it all go home emotionally in the same way? So again, this has some reference to that question about what does the word mean. When I think about it, 3 or 4 things stand out right away. We were discussing earlier this question of how is a poem made. Now, because Keki was so preoccupied with these questions of authority and what it is that rulers owe their subjects or their citizens, for him, Ashoka's life was a very key, pivotal turning point. Because unusually among rulers, Ashoka actually demonstrates remorse. Usually the nature of power and authority is such that you never admit remorse. There's no repentance for your actions. And the history, particularly the history of the 20th century, is full of, and we see it happening around us today. I mean, today we've been living through 2 years of an unbelievable genocide in Gaza. And there's absolutely no repentance or remorse or atonement for it. So in the context of that, the present that we're living through, atonement is incredible. Also, I was very struck, it struck me then and strikes me even more strongly now. We don't actually know the names of Ashoka's scribes. The scribes or masons who carved the edicts, such as Dhori, which is probably the closest to him in Orissa. But Dharuwala gives his scribe a name, and that's not an accidental name. What does the choice of Kartikeya tell us? Who is Kartikeya? I mean, whose name is that actually, apart from the scribe? Exactly. It's the god of war. So it's incredible that this elaborate statement of atonement is being addressed to the scribe who is the god of war. And think about the gesture. What is the gesture here? A king is speaking to a scribe who is a god, asking him to take something down. Now, where have we heard something like that before? It's the primal scene of the Mahabharata. It's Vyasa is not king, Vyasa is the sage, but his scribe is a god. Ganesh is his scribe, and he's writing the epic of war. So it's intriguing to see that an Anglophone Indian poet who's reaching out to a very primal moment in Indian literature, in our classical literature, and offering a sort of parallel to that, if you will. Here too, someone is making an elaborate statement about war and its sorrows. The scribe is a god, the scribe is the god of war. So there's something quite moving about that. Also, unlike the Ramanujan, where through the medium of irony, it's that register of enumeration, reportage, journalism that is used as a counterpoint to poetics. Here, it's also about language. It's about finding the right language in which to express your emotions. Constantly through the poem, we say, don't use high-flown language, don't talk about this, talk about this instead. So, this poem is also about the ars poetica. It's about the poetic art. It's about choosing language. It's also about addressing your audience in terms that make sense to their historical crisis. So, in effect, although this may not be 100% accurate historically, you could think of this poem as something the king says right after Kalinga, right after the war, when he's had his conversion to Buddhism and then is creating the edict that then goes up in Delhi. When he says, we will engrave this message on volcanic rock right here where the earth still reeks of slaughter. So think about the temporality of the poem. It's happening. This testament in language is taking shape, still within the context of an experience that defies language. That the kind of anguish and suffering that is taking place here, the people who suffered it still don't have words for it. So the king is also very aware of this. So he's aware also that he's talking about what he's gone through, but he needs to be sensitive to what he's visited, the havoc he's visited a lot of people. So there are multiple levels of sensitivity that are built into this poem. And of course there's also the aspect, speaking of how poets make their poems, so much of this poem depends also on extensive reading and research. Now, I have a novelist friend who at one point was this, I often offer this example. I was late to a meeting with him once and he said, "What held you up?" And I said, "I was doing some research for a poem. I was writing a poem on Harlem." So he sort of fell about laughing and he said, "Poetry falls from heaven. What do poets need to research for? It's we, the novelists, who do our research." So I said, "No, believe it or not, poetry needs some kinds of poetry, some kinds of poems need research as well." And this poem, Garavala's poem, would not have been possible without a certain amount of reading that has prepared the poet to come to this point. This text arises also from a deep engagement with secondary literature, with the edicts themselves and their texts, with the secondary literature of the subject. And it speaks to a kind of sensibility that Rawala's was. Even the last few books that he published, he was thinking back to the Persian wars and the Greeks. He was thinking back to Babylon and Mesopotamia. He was preeminently the poet of historical experience. And in a sense, he's not talking about something that happened long ago. This resonates for us because this is still very much our world today. Responses to the poem?
Responses,
and to my reading.
questions, how poems are built, how poems are made. This particular form, dramatic monologue, is familiar to the students.
Browning.
Yes.
Yeah, for instance.
Or even in Tennyson,
That's right.
something like Telemachus.
That's
Yeah, Ulysses is speaking to his son. Yeah, the king speaking to the scribe, Karthikeya.
Yeah.
So the form is familiar to them. How a poem is built, he has chosen this particular form. The dramatic monologue, yes. And this is so contemporary. Yes.
Which also speaks to how, certain forms are not trapped within what you might think of as their literary context. They are not only alive today, but they actually allow us to express the back and forth of how one thinks. That's the great, the glory of the dramatic monologue. It's not just a simple enunciation of something you've thought out. You're thinking as you go. And that comes through in what he's saying. He's stopping himself, he's rethinking a question, he's refining a thought, he's taking into account what the scribe might be wanting to do. He said, "No, don't make it scribal, we need to find a new language." So, yeah. And also the fact that there are certain communications of Ashoka which are addressed to the Indo-Greek kings. Antiochus was Antiocha, Megas was Maga, Alexander was Alikasundra. And the fact that that comes into this, so that also really creates a certain texture to the poem. That you're leaping out of the poem almost through hypertext to other things that are referred to. So whilst you're reading this, in your mind, you're also connecting into other kinds of texts that you've read, other contexts, Yeah.
So, since you were talking about form and the kind of dramatic monologue this particular poem is following, it made me think back to the previous poem which we were discussing, Ramakrishna's poem. And since we were talking about form, there is something which struck me. Apologies since I'm primarily talking about the Ramakrishna poem.
Sure.
But so in that particular poem, we see that the lines are deliberately short. They're very short. And it reminded me of something called the swing flow. It's a particular technique in music which is followed in the genre of music which is called rap. And so in unlike usual rap music, which focuses on internal rhyme schemes, which focuses on end rhymes, there is a rhyming quality in the continuous dialogue which Ramanujan follows, and compared, if we are talking about this point in comparison to that, it's even though a river is a continuous dialogue, it's in no way linear. It's fragmented internally, and it does not have a particular one-dimensional voice of a particular narrator. Because as Sir said, that there are certain instances, there are of course a lot of repetitions in the poem, and there are certain instances which does not belong to the poet itself. It's a different voice, it's a different narrator. And that's something which I feel like is largely followed in contemporary rap music, and I think we're not even aware of it. There's this one particular artist called Kendrick Lamar, who is also the only rap artist to win a Pulitzer for music.
Okay.
So in his last album, there's this one particular track called Father Time, where he's talking about generational trauma and how African American men have suffered because of a lack of a father figure. And he uses this particular swing flow, which is so very similar to the poem which we read of Ramanujan. So that's what came to my mind, and I wanted to do it.
Thank you for sharing that, because again, it's sorry, it's actually that's what I meant earlier on when I talked about musicality. It's not. It's often in musical forms and musical genres that you'll find some of the closest parallels to kind of experimentation going on here. So thank you for that swing flow. I will hold that in mind. Also takes us back to a time when there wasn't so much of a difference between what was happening, let's say, in Shakespeare, what is happening on stage, and what is happening in music. You know, I think we tend to make these separations more in the era of print, but before that, or you think of the world of mehfils and mushairas in late Mughal Delhi. And the poets, the musicians, the dancers all inhabit the same world. So questions of how to craft a certain formal temporality, what do you do with beat, what do you do with phrasing, syncopation, these are all questions that are being asked by musicians and dancers and poets as well. So thank you, we need to be attentive to these conjunctions.
He is our PG student. Shall we move on to the...
Sure. How would you do time? Let's read two of the Ulysses.
Just one more incorporation is
Yes.
what earlier points. That as far as the history goes, the sense of history goes, this is very close to Vivekananda's this concept. When he's talking about all those downtrodden, enormous people, and they are the blood. Not only if you want to practically almost every person in India itself.
Okay, that was an observation. Okay, all right. Because I think it's also a question of whether one is speaking for or with, in a way. I think the king speaks to the scribe, in my mind, is in spirit closer to something like Mother, Shrikant Verma's booklet, the poem in Hindi, which again has to do with these questions of what happens when a kingdom is collapsing. Who exercises power, what is the connection between the rulers and the ruled. So yeah, but thank you for bringing that into the discussion. I don't think we have poems that deal with precisely that sort of, how do you stand alongside the vulnerable or the downtrodden. But elements of that come into some of these poems, so we attentive to that as well. Who wants to read Eunice D'Souza's Advice to Women? And then I'll read the other one that I have Eunice. Go for it. Advice to Women.
maybe new generation poets who are writing about caste and Veena Chandaswamy.
Oh, very much so, yeah.
Yes, but that angle, that perspective is now. The one who raised this question is the colleague whom you didn't meet in the department. Yes, he has joined us now. Washim Mondu, Professor Washim.
Advice to women, Eunice D'Souza. Keep cats if you want to learn to cope with the otherness of others. Otherness is not always neglect. Cats return to their litter trays when they need to. Don't cuss out of the window as their enemies. That stare of perpetual surprise in those great green eyes will teach you to die alone.
I'm genuinely interested to learn how this poem is presented in class and taught.
Who teaches you in this decision? I know.
So, thank you.
Usually related to the nature of taxes. Now, what I do is I usually relate this poem to the nature of taxes and how lonely women over the years have been associated with cats. Because it's a very common archetype in a
Cat
society.
lady.
Cat lady.
As I think Trump was saying at some point. Yeah.
So I link it to, when they accept cats, when they go for cats, they are kind of breaking down patriarchy. The patriarchal perception that this is how a woman must live their life, they must get married, they must have a life of one husband, their name, their existence must revolve around that of their husbands. So when they adopt cats, when they embrace cats, they kind of overthrow patriarchy. This is what I primarily focus on.
I respond to that, the idea that if you can lead another kind of life and you can have also this sort of, if you will, a notion of interspecies companionship. And that's actually how she lived her life. She had her cats, she had stray dogs that were coming, and she had budgies, she had birds, and a parrot, 2 parrots. One of those parrots had a really foul tongue, I have to say. I don't know who taught him all this stuff, but yeah, Ulysses' parrots were very...
I think in Mehrotra's illustrated history of Indian literature in English, the portrait of D'Souza has
Oh,
the parrot.
there is a portrait of the parrot on the ship. Yeah. But I'm also struck by how, in this and other poems, I think this is from a collection called Women in Dutch Pictures. There's also a sense of somehow being anchored in this intermediate space between living together but not necessarily communicating. So I think in many ways those poems of Eunice D'Souza are about the interval, about a state of being that promises connection but an opposite state of being that prevents it in a strange way. So keep cats if you want to learn to cope with the otherness of others. So there's something very harsh, very melancholy about it. It feels like it might be ironic, but I think it's deeper yet. There's a level of anguish in the poem, in a strange way. It's almost as if this is training for life. This might be a way to inoculate yourself against disappointment. Otherness is not always neglect. Cats return to their litter trays when they need to. So in a way, it's what she seems to be suggesting here is that this alterity, this non-communication, isn't always about indifference, because there's also an element of routine which can erode relationships, can erode communication. So I would also think about these elements, these other affective elements that come into the poem. Cats return to their litter trays when they need to, don't cuss out of the window at their enemies. That's a reference to the parents used to do that. That stare of perpetual surprise in those great green eyes will teach you to die alone. That's something about when you had cats, you sometimes know the cats are, every cat is an individual, but most of them have this sense of coming from another world and of belonging somewhere else. So it's incredible that, it's a certain kind of genre of a poem about a pet, but it carries all of this deeper sense of emotional anguish, questions about how to live, and also, of course, what was very much a part of D'Souza's way of dealing with the world, which is to frame a feminist politics, which was as personal as it was public.
Yeah.
But I would think Poland calls for very particular kind of sensitivity as well. But I was thinking about to read alongside that this other poem of Eunice D'Souza. It's called D'Souza Prabhu. I like the poem very
Like,
much.
if you allow me to interrupt.
Yes, of course.
Which particular poetic ingredient, you call it, or a device, you call it, he is actually, like a fulcrum towards this poem. Is it the symbol or the objective correlative using the cat? Cat becomes a symbol, or cat becomes an objective correlative through which she is reflecting certain emotional states as well.
Yes. But I in this poem, my own response to it has been I tend to think a little contextually, which may be a frame. But it's a kind of it's a genre of the counsel poem, the advice poem, the voice of experience. It's that kind of. So I sometimes tend to think about where this poem might be in the larger tradition of things. So I don't know if it came out of. The fact is, many of the people that we're looking at here were also reading very similar things through the 60s and 70s. So it's quite possible that Eunice D'Souza was reading Ramanujan's translations from the Akamba Puram poems, where many of them have to do with the woman seeking advice from an older woman, older woman offering advice to a young woman. I don't know if Eunice was also reading Anand Mehrotra's fairly long-term work on the Satwa and Hala, the Gana Saptashati translations, which also have this kind of intergenerational voices where older and younger women address each other.
So right at this juncture, what will be your advice to the students who are caught up in their studies for semester, midterms and end terms?
Oh my God.
That poets are actually readers as well, whereas our reading habit is coming down.
That's something I usually say to poets ask for advice, young poets ask for advice, and I start by saying I'm very happy to seek advice myself. But if there's any piece of advice that I would suggest is you can't really be a writer unless you're a reader. And unless you're a reader who is open to surprise. Because some people tend to read along an itinerary of reading that they're comfortable with. I think it's important to also just step out of your comfort zone. Either read in languages that you are not that familiar with, you could do that through translation, or you could actually take the trouble to learn another language. But also read genres that for whatever reason you haven't been too open towards in certain ways, or that you might feel are kind of below your dignity as a reader of high literature. There's a great deal to be learned from reading thrillers, by the way. a certain kind of, in every genre, there's something you learn about managing voice, tonality, temporality. These are the questions you would work on in any genre that you write.
I will just interject.
Sorry.
I'll just interject something.
Sure.
I think this isn't a poem about cats at all. It is kind of a commentary on the Indian marriage system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would think so. Like the women are trapped in relationships that have been arranged for them by their family and all, with emotionally unavailable men who come back, who return to their litter trays, who come back for just their base desires. And there's this certain sense of the scare of perpetual surprise, the sense of very certain sense of detachment in them, And in the final line, it will teach you to die alone. After going through all of that, you will learn that it is somewhat preferable to not engage in that social ritual at all. I feel this commentary as well. Yeah.
Oh, very much. Yeah, that ties in with your thesis about the critique of patriarchy. But it is very much a critique of, because it's not like the cat or the lover that the cat stands for is making any attempt to overcome the radical underness. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Who wants to read the other Eunice poem for me? And then we bring these poems together.
কবিতা পাঠ করবে ইউনিসের আরেকটা কবিতা কে করবে? Any volunteer? Yeah. He's the new PG student. He's the older one.
Older, sir?
He is the older PG student and he is the new PG student.
Okay.
No, I'm not going to delve deep down and discover. I'm really D'Souza Prabhu. Even if Prabhu was no fool and got the best of both worlds, Catholic, Brahmin, I can hear his fat chuckle still. No matter that my name is Greek, my surname Portuguese, my language alien, there are ways of belonging. I belong with the lame ducks. I heard it said my parents wanted a boy. I have done my best to qualify. I hate the blood stains on my clothes and let my breast sag. Words, the weapon to crucify.
Thank you. I chose this poem A because I like it very much, but B also because it opens up, as the Darwa poem does, the question of how much context you need to make sense of a poem. So in this case, you have to situate the poem in the context of Eunice D'Souza's antagonism towards a certain kind of if you will, ethnic context that she came out of. And you have to know something about the history of Goa. She was, although she was born in Pune and grew up there and came to Bombay, the family was Goan. And you have to know something of the history of 16th century Goa to know where this poem is coming from. This is the kind of poem where you begin to wonder, does this poem need a footnote? How would someone who doesn't know that history grapple with it? I don't know. But before I go to that, what was your sense of it? I mean, does the poem carry enough for you to really need a footnote? Do you understand? Who wants to answer that? How would you, if you just presented with this poem, what's your sense?
Is it that it is situated in the world of God of small things?
God of small things?
Yes.
Say more, why?
God of small things carries a similar context, yes, when the Syrian Orthodox churches, unlike in other places in India, where they converted the people from the lower caste, it was the Brahmins who they converted. It's the same with what the poet talks about here, the Catholic Brahmin.
Yeah.
So that's what she's highlighting, that the religion, as to how religion has been presented to us. This is what it does. It takes in what is the worst from different parts of different aspects of society and incorporates it to maintain us on the reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will say this poem takes off from where Kamla Das's introduction ends and looks forward to Mahesh Dadani's Tara.
Oh my God, okay, that's quite loud. Yeah, because when I look at it, I think it's a manifesto. It's a poem that, but that also takes from that tradition the powerful trope of the crucifixion, but it turns it into a weapon that is free of religion. It's crucifixion there as to crucify critique. It's that kind of. I'll just unpack the poem in that sense. You know, it also refers to a very particular moment in the 1970s when, after the Second Vatican Council, there was what's called a policy of inculturation in the Catholic Church in India, which meant that the church would then be open to the cultural forms of here, South Asia, Latin America. But it allowed a lot of people to go back to their pre-conversion histories, in a way, so there was a liberal redemptive aspect of it, which was that instead of being a defensive Eurocentric kind of church, it became a church, a Catholic church in India particularly, was able to open itself up to imagery, to narratives, to mythology and so on, which was more broadly Indian. The less redemptive, the downside of it was that the Catholic elites, who had never forgotten the Narendrapur Brahmin, in Goa particularly, decided that they would use their own Brahmin surnames again. You know, so then suddenly from the 70s onwards, you have the D'Souza Prabhus, the Sikara Khaleds. You know, it's a dilemma, because on the one hand, it seems like they are going back to a time before the rupture of pilgrimage. But with that gesture comes also this reassertion of a certain caste pride, what you just call hegemony. So, considering that in actual life they had never lost those privileges, it just meant that this is, you just simply reaffirm your privileges. So that's what she means, Catholic Brahmin, I can hear his fat chuckle still. And then through the middle of the poem, there's this question of how does one, again, it's the question that plagued that whole generation of Anglophone Indian poets, which is, my name is Greek, my surname Portuguese, a language alien, there are ways of belonging. You know, it's, how do you, somewhere in one of Liston's poems, there's the line, my backward place is where I am, right? It's, how do you commit yourself to a country that doesn't seem to want you for some reason? How do you affirm, despite possible choices that lead you away, how do you reconnect yourself? But I belong with the lame ducks. There's a moment of some wayward humor there, you know. It's the idea of somehow belonging not with the kind of success that the earlier stanzas have suggested, but that she actually belongs with the vulnerable, with the marginalized in certain ways. And how does that come through? It comes through what someone once described as the proletariat of womanhood. You know, it's quite a compelling phrase when you see yourself. The ways in which you characterize the proletariat, right? Is it the working class? Is it the marginalized castes? But then if you see women, and I'm very aware that this is an all-male audience, we are in a very particular kind of situation. But what D'Souza does towards the end of this poem is really to remind us of how patriarchy and its expectations can actually either grind women down or force them to approximate to some fantasy of what it means to be male. I've done my best to quantify. I hate the bloodstains on my clothes and let my breasts sag. But as she writes about all of this, she gets to something else, the opposite, the counterpoint. Words, the weapon to crucify. So in a way, I mean, in 7 or 8 lines, very short, very sharp lines, she goes from bearing witness to how she could have been subjugated by patriarchy to an expression of resistance. And takes from the beginning, from the Catholic Brahmin that she opened with, she takes the image of the crucifix, but not the image. She takes the gesture, the verb form. It's not the crucifixion, it's words, the weapon to crucify. So in a way, it's like reappropriating the image of what in her case stands for patriarchy and religious orthodoxy, and to turn that around and use that as a weapon against the people or the forces of the establishments and the institutions that threaten to subjugate her. A lot of the poetry that she wrote in that period would have to be seen not only as making a universal kind of appeal through the trope of through the lens of feminism, but it also carried on an argument with her own very specific birth community. And the more I think about it, the more I think that might be quite rare in Anglophone context. It seems somehow more organic to do it if you're writing in Marathi or Gujarati or Bangla. I'm not quite sure why that is, but that's a discussion we can have at some point. Yeah. At least partly